The lawyer's voice trembled slightly as he unfolded the final page of my late husband's will. My daughter-in-law, Grace, leaned closer to my son, her hand resting delicately on his knee, her smile as soft as honey. She whispered, "Don't worry, darling. Everything will go to you just as your father wanted." But when the lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the clause labeled Addendum C, the air shifted. I caught a faint scent of my husband's old cologne, oak and citrus, still clinging to the parchment. The sound of the ceiling fan seemed louder than ever, slicing the silence into trembling fragments. Then came the words that froze her smile midair. In the event of misrepresentation or marital deception, assets shall revert to the original estate trustee, Mrs. Margaret Ellis. Her fingers slipped from my son's knee. The warmth drained from her face, replaced by something raw, cornered. And in that moment, I realized the sweetest whispers often hide the sharpest lies. If you were sitting in that room, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent, letting the lies unravel on their own, or spoken up before the final word was read? This story isn't just about inheritance. It's about trust, betrayal, and the moment truth takes off its mask. Tell me, where are you listening from? Comment below, and I might choose your story for next week's feature, because sometimes the quietest families hide the loudest secrets. My name is Margaret Ellis, 61 years old, widow of Harold Ellis, founder of Ellis Real Estate Holdings, a company that began from one broken-down house on Maple Avenue and grew into a small empire of 23 rental properties across the state. When Harold passed away last autumn, our estate was valued at just over $4.8 million, not counting the house we built together, a 2-story Georgian with white columns, brick steps, and a garden Harold tended himself until the week before his heart gave out. The scent of rosemary and soil still clings to his gloves on the porch. Every morning I catch it and feel both comforted and betrayed by time's cruelty. After his death, it was supposed to be simple. Harold had always been organized, methodical. He kept ledgers, filed receipts, and made sure I never had to worry about the legal side of anything. "Everything's in order," he said the night before his final surgery. "You'll be fine, Maggie." But he didn't account for Grace. Grace entered our lives 5 years ago, a radiant 28-year-old event planner with flawless manners and a voice like sugared wine. She met my son, Daniel, at a charity gala, and within 6 months, they were married under a canopy of roses I didn't choose. From the beginning, something about her never sat right with me. She smiled too much when she didn't have to. She touched things that weren't hers, my tea set, my late mother's pearls, as if testing ownership. Yet Daniel adored her. He said she brought light into his life after a difficult breakup, and I wanted to believe him. For a while, I convinced myself that my unease was jealousy, the quiet rivalry older women sometimes feel toward younger ones. Grace made Daniel laugh again, and for that alone, I tried to stay silent. But silence, I've learned, is often the soil where deception grows. Our relationship began to crack over small things, misplaced mail, unauthorized changes to household accounts, odd phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Grace always explained them away with a giggle or a quick kiss on Daniel's cheek. He'd look at her, spellbound, and the conversation would end. When Harold's health began to decline, she was strangely attentive, always nearby, always ready to fetch his pills, record his medications, arrange his doctor's visits. My husband appreciated her help, but I noticed her eyes lingering on his office door. She asked too many questions about financial succession and emergency transfers. The first true fracture came 3 weeks after Harold's funeral. Grace suggested that Daniel and I modernize the estate, consolidate accounts, transfer properties into a joint portfolio for tax efficiency. I may have been old-fashioned, but I wasn't naive. The woman had barely worn her mourning dress, yet she was already talking about shifting deeds. I declined, politely but firmly. Her smile faltered for just a second before recovering. That was when I knew. One night, while organizing Harold's files, I noticed a missing binder, the one labeled Estate Contingency, 2019-2023. I tore through drawers and cabinets, the scent of dust and old paper filling the room. My fingers brushed across the faint outline where it once rested. Someone had taken it. I didn't say a word to Daniel. I couldn't bear to make him choose between his mother and his wife. Not yet. Instead, I called Harold's lawyer, Mr. Langford, a man in his 70s with sharp eyes and a voice like brittle parchment. We agreed to review the will privately before any family meeting. That's when I learned about the addendum signed by Harold 6 months before his passing, a clause protecting the estate against fraud or coercion. It was witnessed and notarized. The signature was authentic. Still, something gnawed at me. Why had Harold never told me about it? Why did he keep it secret, even from me? The night before the will reading, I barely slept. Rain lashed against the windows, and the house creaked like an old ship. I sat by the fireplace, watching embers fade, thinking about the last conversation I had with Harold. He had asked me to trust the paperwork. At the time, I thought he was joking. Now, I wasn't so sure. Grace and Daniel arrived the next morning in coordinated black outfits. She carried a box of pastries for everyone, as though generosity could mask intention. Her perfume, jasmine with a trace of musk, filled the parlor, drowning out even the scent of coffee. When the lawyer entered, she greeted him with a handshake that lasted a beat too long. Her eyes sparkled. She truly believed she had already won, if only she knew what was coming. I watched her sit beside Daniel, her hand resting lightly on his arm, whispering sweetly about how proud Harold would be. And for a brief, treacherous second, I almost pitied her. She'd built her entire future on the assumption that charm could outwit law. But paper doesn't lie. Ink doesn't flinch. And a single signature can rewrite destinies. That morning, as the rain softened outside and the smell of wet earth crept in through the open window, I realized my husband had left me more than money. He'd left me a test. One final opportunity to protect our family's name from those who wore masks too well. What I didn't know yet was that Grace's mask would not fall quietly. It would tear itself apart in front of everyone, one revelation at a time. It began with a phone call I almost ignored. Mr. Langford's assistant rang me early one morning, her voice trembling through static. "Mrs. Ellis, I think you should come to the office. There's something you need to see." Something not included in the copy of the will we reviewed. My heart thudded once, hard. I was standing in Harold's study, dust motes floating through the shaft of morning light that crossed his empty leather chair. The smell of paper and cedar still lingered. I pressed the receiver tighter. "What do you mean, not included?" She hesitated. "A supplementary statement, handwritten. It was sealed in an envelope marked to be opened only upon dispute. I told her I'd be there within the hour. On the drive downtown, the world outside looked washed out, pale. The trees were bare, the wind sharp enough to sting through the window crack. I could almost hear Harold's dry humor. "You always wanted control, Maggie. Be careful what you wish for." When I arrived, Mr. Langford greeted me with his usual precision, tie straight, spectacles glinting. He led me to his desk and placed a cream envelope in front of me. The handwriting was unmistakably Harold's, bold but faltering near the edges. The moment I slid the letter free, a faint scent of his cologne escaped, oak and citrus again, cruelly familiar. The message was short. "If anything happens that feels wrong, trust your instincts. The one who smiles the widest often hides the sharpest teeth. Protect Daniel. Protect what we built." Below his signature was a small note in another hand. Attached, bank authorization. Video 120323. "Video?" I asked. Mr. Langford nodded. "It's from the security camera during one of his account visits, 2 months before he died. He wanted it documented." He inserted a flash drive into his laptop. The screen flickered, and there was Harold, sitting upright at the bank desk, pale but alert. The audio crackled faintly. Then Grace appeared beside him, her expression all honey and devotion. "Dad," she said softly. She'd insisted on calling him that. "Daniel and I just want what's fair." Harold's jaw tightened. "Fairness is earned, Grace." She leaned closer, her tone changing slightly. "Then maybe you should reconsider the signatures before people start asking why you've been confused lately." Mr. Langford paused the video. My throat burned. "Confused?" I repeated. He sighed. "Your husband recorded this conversation with bank permission. He wanted proof in case anyone accused him of diminished capacity." I stared at the frozen image of Grace, her eyes sharp, her smile thin and triumphant. Every nerve in me screamed. "She tried to manipulate him," I whispered. "Or worse," Mr. Langford murmured. "We'll present this only if necessary. It's not part of the will. Yet." I left the office with the flash drive clutched in my palm like a weapon. Outside, the city smelled of cold rain and exhaust. My breath fogged the windshield as I sat in the car, trembling. Grace's mask had cracked for the first time, just a glimpse beneath the sugar. That evening, Daniel called. "Mom, Grace wants us to host a dinner for you this weekend. Just family to make things right." The words tasted bitter. "Dinner?" "Yes. She said you've been distant since Dad's passing." I looked at the drive resting on the table, its metal gleaming in the lamplight. A part of me wanted to confront him right then, to shout the truth, but Harold's note echoed in my head. Protect Daniel. So I agreed. "All right, darling. Dinner sounds lovely." As I hung up, thunder rumbled far off, the kind that shakes windows before a storm arrives. The air smelled faintly of rain again, and the lights flickered once. Somewhere deep down, I knew. The dinner wouldn't be reconciliation. It would be revelation. Saturday evening arrived cloaked in drizzle. The driveway shimmered with puddles, and the smell of wet asphalt mingled with the lilacs blooming along the fence Harold had built by hand. I carried a tin of lemon cookies, Harold's favorite, because appearances matter even when war is about to begin. Grace opened the door before I could knock. "Mother Ellis," she sang, every syllable dipped in honey. Candlelight from the chandelier glowed on her pearl earrings. "We're so happy you came." Her voice curled through the hall like perfume. Behind her, I saw Daniel arranging wine glasses, his face relieved, unaware that the storm outside had already stepped into the house. The dining room smelled of rosemary chicken and lemon polish. Grace had set the table perfectly, silver aligned, napkins folded like swans. Even the playlist was precise, soft jazz, faint enough to hide tension, but not erase it. We ate politely. Conversation tiptoed around safe topics: the weather, Daniel's projects, a neighbor's new puppy. Yet beneath it, an invisible current pulsed. My fingers traced the rim of my glass while Grace spoke about streamlining family finances, as if she were discussing charity work. Then she produced a slim folder from her handbag and placed it beside Daniel's plate. "I drafted a few ideas," she said sweetly. "A modern approach to property management. Consolidation under a single signatory makes tax filing so much simpler." Daniel smiled, tired, but trusting. "Grace has been working really hard on this." I forced a smile. "How efficient of you, dear. May I?" Her hand hovered protectively over the folder. "It's mostly technical. I wouldn't want to bore you." "Oh, I never mind a little boredom," I replied, my voice as calm as the ticking clock behind us. She hesitated before sliding the papers toward me. The first page bore the Ellis Holdings letterhead, my husband's logo, but the fine print made my stomach turn. The document proposed transferring 17 of our 23 properties into a joint management trust, where Grace and Daniel would serve as co-trustees. At the bottom, under the signature line for Harold's widow, was a faintly traced digital copy of my own signature. Evidence number. I looked up, meeting her gaze. "This seems familiar." Grace's lashes fluttered. "Daniel said you might have forgotten signing it during the funeral week. You were under such stress." Daniel looked confused. "Mom, didn't you—" "I never signed this," I interrupted quietly. Grace's smile tightened. "Are you sure?" "Quite." For a moment the room froze. Rain thudded harder against the windows. The smell of rosemary thickened, almost choking. Daniel rubbed his temples. "Grace, maybe we should—" But she cut him off. "Darling." The audacity in her tone ignited something deep in me. Not anger exactly, but clarity. I stood slowly, folded the forged papers, and placed them back in the folder. "Grace," I said, "you're right about one thing. Memory can be fragile. That's why we write things down, why we sign them properly, why we date them." Her smile cracked. "What are you implying?" "I'm not implying," I said softly. "I'm confirming." Daniel's voice wavered. "Mom, what's happening?" I reached into my handbag and set the flash drive beside my plate. "Just a small keepsake from your father." Grace's face drained of color. She recognized the silver casing. Her hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. "Would you mind if we watched something after dessert?" I asked. "Your father loved family viewings." She shook her head. "Not tonight, Margaret." "Let's not—" "Actually," Daniel said, weary, "maybe that's a good idea. I miss Dad's voice." The irony made my heart ache. After dinner, we gathered in the living room. The fire crackled, throwing orange light across the portrait of Harold above the mantel. I inserted the drive into the television port. The video began instantly. Harold at the bank, Grace beside him, her voice as sweet and dangerous as always. "Then maybe you should reconsider the signatures," she said on screen, "before people start asking why you've been confused lately." Daniel's breath hitched. "Grace, what is this?" She stumbled to her feet. It's taken out of context. Harold's reply came clear and cold through the speakers. I may be old, Grace, but confusion isn't the same as distrust, and you, my dear, have earned the latter. The clip ended. The fire popped once, a spark leaping up like punctuation. Daniel looked from her to me, his expression collapsing. You tried to... Grace, tell me this isn't real. She reached for him, tears glistening too perfectly. Baby, he misunderstood. I was just helping. But the illusion had shattered. He stepped back. Helping who? The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Only the clock ticked, methodical, pitiless. Grace sank into the chair, face pale, mascara streaking. You can't prove forgery, she whispered. I met her eyes. Oh, but we can. The original file's metadata is already with Mr. Langford, dated 3 days after Harold's death. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. I could almost hear the structure of her lies collapsing piece by piece. The rain outside softened to a mist. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled away, defeated. Daniel buried his face in his hands. I don't even know who you are. Grace looked up then, her voice a thread. Your mother hates me. She's always hated me. I exhaled slowly. Grace, hate requires respect. What I feel for you is recognition. I've seen your kind before. She flinched as if struck. The firelight caught the tear sliding down her cheek. You can't take him from me. I didn't answer. Some truths don't need words. That night, when I finally left their house, the air smelled of damp earth and extinguished candles. My shoes clicked against the stones like a metronome marking the end of denial. In my pocket, the folded copy of the forged trust deed crackled softly, the sound of evidence breathing. Behind me, through the curtain, I saw Grace clutch Daniel's arm, pleading. He stood motionless, eyes fixed on the document in his hand, and though the storm had passed, I knew the real deluge was still coming. In court, under oath, with witnesses. What I didn't yet know was that Grace had another card to play, one that could twist everything again. The following week crawled by like a fever. Every hour felt stretched, strung between suspicion and silence. Daniel stopped returning my calls. Grace, predictably, launched her defense in the oldest way possible, by rewriting the narrative. She posted a photo on social media, her holding Harold's framed portrait, captioned, "Always honoring the man who taught me family means forgiveness." Hundreds of sympathy comments flooded in. I stared at the screen, the bitter taste of disbelief thick on my tongue. But I couldn't afford outrage. I needed strategy. Monday morning, Mr. Langford called. Mrs. Ellis, he said. I received a subpoena request from Grace's attorney. She's contesting the authenticity of the addendum clause. I clenched the receiver. On what grounds? She claims undue influence, that you manipulated Harold while he was ill to favor yourself. For a moment, the room blurred. The accusation was obscene, but also clever. If she managed to paint me as a controlling widow, the entire case would rot from within. Let her try, I whispered. We'll meet her in daylight. He sighed. Prepare yourself. Court proceedings will require complete disclosure of your communications with Harold. Letters, emails, everything. After hanging up, I walked to Harold's study, each floorboard creaking under the weight of memory. The room smelled faintly of dust and pine. I opened the old roll-top desk and pulled out a box labeled Personal Correspondence. Inside were years of letters, mostly notes Harold had left me on mornings when he woke earlier. Simple things, grocery lists, reminders, tiny declarations of love scribbled between meetings. But tucked beneath them was an envelope I'd never noticed before, sealed with wax. My pulse quickened. The seal bore the same E insignia Harold used for his company. I broke it carefully. Inside lay 3 pages, his handwriting shaky, but determined. If this letter reaches you, Maggie, it means something went wrong. I added Grace to the family business accounts last year against my better judgment. She promised it was temporary. Recently, I discovered several irregular withdrawals under Daniel's name. If I can't fix this before my surgery, protect our assets. Don't confront her directly. She thrives on chaos. Show Daniel when he's ready the truth, not vengeance. H.E. My throat tightened. Harold had seen it coming. I scanned the pages again and froze at a faint indentation on the 3rd, the imprint of a phone number written and later erased. Under the light, I could just make out the digits. That night, curiosity won. I called. A man answered, cautious, professional. "This is Michael Reeves, branch auditor, Bank of Hanover." I hesitated. "Mr. Reeves, this is Margaret Ellis. My husband Harold dealt with your branch. I found your number in his notes." There was a long pause, then a sigh. "Mrs. Ellis." "I was wondering when you'd call. Your husband contacted me last year regarding unauthorized transactions. He wanted them traced quietly." The air left my lungs. "And?" "We found the transactions routed to a shell company, GDL Consulting. The account owner, Grace Donovan." Grace Donovan, her maiden name. The room spun. I gripped the edge of the desk. "Can you send me copies of those statements?" "I can, but only through official counsel," he said. "If you authorize Mr. Langford, I'll forward them immediately." Evidence number 3 had just surfaced, though I didn't yet realize its full power. The next morning, the world seemed sharper. The sun glinted off the wet pavement, and birds sang as if mocking the storm that was brewing again. I met Daniel for lunch at a small cafe near the courthouse. He looked exhausted, eyes shadowed. "Mom," he began, "Grace says you've been working with Dad's lawyer behind my back." I stirred my tea, watching the steam twist upward. "I have." "Why? Don't you trust me?" "It's not about trust, darling. It's about proof. You deserve to see things as they are, not as you wish them to be." He rubbed his jaw. "She's pregnant, Mom." The words hit harder than I expected. My spoon slipped, clinking against porcelain. "What?" "She told me last night. 6 weeks. I wanted you to hear it from me." I stared at him, speechless. The timing, the sudden announcement right after exposure. It was no coincidence. Grace was cornered, and a child, real or not, could be her escape hatch. "Daniel," I said carefully, "if it's true, I'll welcome the child. But please, verify before you let emotion make law." He frowned. "You think she'd lie about that?" "Do you?" He didn't answer. That evening, I received an encrypted email from Mr. Langford. Attached were the bank statements from GDL Consulting. A clear trail of transfers totaling $220,000, each withdrawal marked with the forged initials DE for Daniel Ellis. The final transfer had occurred 5 days after Harold's death. I printed them out, the faint heat of the paper still clinging to my fingers. The proof was cold, absolute. But as I stared at the figures, one detail caught my eye: the recipient field of the last transaction. Dr. Pamela Keene, OB-GYN. A doctor. Something inside me turned to ice. The next day, I called the clinic listed. "Dr. Keene's office," a nurse answered. "I'm inquiring about a patient, Grace Donovan Ellis. She recently had an appointment." The nurse hesitated. "I can't release medical information, ma'am." "Of course," I said. "But please, could you at least confirm whether she was here last week?" A pause, then softly. "Her last visit was 4 months ago." 4 months. Not 6 weeks. Grace's supposed pregnancy was fiction, another manipulation, another lie. I ended the call and sat motionless, listening to the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick sounded like a countdown. That evening, I forwarded the new evidence to Mr. Langford. His reply came quickly. "Understood. We'll file a motion to introduce these records. But be cautious. She may anticipate the move and strike first." He was right. The following morning, a courier arrived with an envelope bearing the seal of Grace's lawyer. Inside was a notice of intent to contest, accusing me of emotional harassment, financial control, and fabrication of evidence. She'd gone on the offensive. As I read the letter, sunlight spilled through the blinds, slicing the room into alternating stripes of light and shadow. I realized that this wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was a chess match for legacy, reputation, and truth itself. And the next move would determine everything. The hearing was set for the following Thursday. The days leading up to it blurred into a haze of phone calls, documents, and sleepless nights. Every sound in the house seemed amplified. The kettle's whistle too shrill, the tick of the clock a relentless reminder of what was coming. The faint smell of burnt toast lingered one morning, a symptom of nerves I pretended not to have. Mr. Langford and I met in his downtown office, surrounded by shelves stacked with decades of legal victories. He slid a thick folder across the polished mahogany desk. "Mrs. Ellis, this contains every verified document we have. Your husband's letter, the bank records, the video, and now the metadata from the forged deed. Once these are presented, there's no going back." I nodded, my fingers trembling slightly as I flipped through the papers. "Then we proceed." He adjusted his glasses. "Be prepared, Grace's attorney will attack your credibility. They'll try to paint you as controlling, manipulative, grief-stricken. They'll say you fabricated everything to keep power." A humorless smile tugged at my lips. Let them. The truth doesn't need defending, only patience. That night, rain beat against the windows again, the same sound as the night before Harold's funeral. I sat at his old desk, tracing the edge of his fountain pen. On the blotter lay his final letter, now sealed in a transparent sleeve. The scent of ink and old paper filled the air, and for a moment I imagined him there beside me, murmuring reassurance. "Protect Daniel," he had written. I intended to, even if that meant breaking him first. When Thursday came, the courthouse smelled of polished wood and faint disinfectant. The hallway buzzed with low murmurs, heels clicking against marble. Grace arrived 15 minutes late, flanked by her lawyer, a man with a perfect suit and a practiced smirk. She wore black again, but not mourning black. It was weaponized, elegant, deliberate. Daniel walked beside her, pale and uncertain. His eyes flickered toward me, then away. Inside the courtroom, the hum of the ceiling fan filled the silence while everyone took their seats. Judge Hawkins presided, stern, gray-haired, and unimpressed by theatrics. When proceedings began, Grace's lawyer rose first. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "this case is not about fraud. It's about grief. Mrs. Ellis, overwhelmed by the loss of her husband, has fabricated narratives to maintain control of his estate. My client, Grace Donovan Ellis, only sought to secure her husband's rightful inheritance. I sat still, hands clasped in my lap, watching Grace's head nod sympathetically at each phrase. Then it was Langford's turn. "Your Honor," he began, voice calm but cutting, "this case is about truth, the kind documented on paper, time-stamped, notarized, and witnessed. What you will hear today are not emotions, but evidence." He introduced Exhibit A, the forged trust deed with the metadata proving it was created after Harold's death. The screen lit up with timestamps, digital trails, and the forged signature side by side with my authentic one. Grace's expression faltered for the first time. "Mrs. Ellis," the judge said, "can you verify that is your signature?" I leaned toward the microphone. "No, Your Honor. Mine is firm, always an upward curve. This one trembles, and my name is spelled Margaret instead of Margaret. My husband would never have allowed such an error." A ripple of whispers crossed the courtroom. Next came Exhibit B, the video from the bank. Harold's recorded voice filled the room, echoing against the wood panels. "Fairness is earned, Grace." For a heartbeat, the air itself seemed to pause. Grace looked down, jaw tight, fingers digging into the edge of the table. Her attorney rose quickly. "Your Honor, that video lacks context. It could have been edited," Langford interrupted smoothly. "The recording was retrieved directly from the bank's security archives, under legal chain of custody. I have the bank's compliance officer ready to testify." Judge Hawkins nodded. "Proceed." Then Langford brought out Exhibit Z, the bank statements from GDL Consulting. Rows of transactions scrolled on the screen. $20,000, $35,000, $50,000, each marked DE. Grace's lawyer tried again. "These could be authorized by Daniel Ellis himself." Langford turned. "Then let's ask him." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "What? I didn't make any transfers." Langford handed him the printed statements. "Please look at the signatures, Mr. Ellis. Do they resemble yours?" He scanned them slowly, his Adam's apple bobbing. "No, mine's always cursive. These are typed initials." Grace shifted in her seat. Her breathing quickened. Langford gestured toward the final page. "And note the last recipient, Dr. Pamela Keene, a physician. We confirmed the transaction date, 4 months ago. Your wife claims she was 6 weeks pregnant." Daniel's head jerked up. "Grace?" Her lawyer tried to intervene, but Judge Hawkins raised a hand. "Let her answer." Grace's voice cracked. "It's complicated. There were medical bills." "For which procedure?" Langford asked quietly. She looked down, lips trembling. "A fertility consultation." "A fertility consultation," Langford repeated. "Paid with funds withdrawn under your husband's name after his father's death." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the air conditioner seemed to stop. Grace's lawyer exhaled sharply. "This is character assassination." "No," Langford said, "it's arithmetic." Daniel buried his face in his hands. "You told me you were pregnant," he whispered. Grace reached for him, desperate. "I did it for us, to protect our future." Her words echoed off the paneled walls, sharp as breaking glass. That was the moment the truth became undeniable. Grace wasn't the victim. She was the architect. The judge called for a short recess. I stood slowly, my knees trembling, and stepped into the hallway. The scent of coffee from a nearby vending machine drifted through the corridor. For the first time in months, I breathed deeply. The air tasted like something close to freedom. When court resumed, Langford presented Harold's final letter. The paper trembled slightly in my hand as I read aloud, "Protect Daniel. Protect what we built." I looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. That's all I ever wanted. Grace's attorney muttered objections, but they barely registered. The tide had turned. Judge Hawkins leaned forward, expression unreadable. "We'll review the evidence in full before rendering a decision. Until then, the estate remains frozen." But we all knew which way the scales were tilting. As we left the courtroom, Daniel stopped me at the door. His voice was low, ragged. "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have listened sooner." I touched his cheek gently. "You had to see it yourself, darling. Love makes fools of the best of us." Behind us, Grace stood alone, her lawyer whispering urgently. For the first time, she didn't look polished or composed, only small, frightened, human. Yet even as pity stirred in me, I sensed she wasn't finished. There was one final letter Harold had written, one the lawyer hadn't mentioned in court. It sat in Langford's desk, unopened, marked to be read upon resolution. Whatever it contained, it would decide how the story truly ended, and I knew, when we opened it, the last mask would finally fall. The next morning arrived gray and heavy. Fog clung to the courthouse steps, softening the edges of stone and shadow. I could smell the damp in my coat as I walked in, the faint scent of coffee following me from the cafe across the street. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed like anxious bees. This would be the final hearing. Grace had requested a chance to clarify her position, a desperate maneuver that Langford called theatrics. But I knew better. When cornered, Grace never surrendered quietly. She was already seated when I entered, dressed in pale blue this time, her hair neatly pinned. The color choice wasn't random. She wanted to look soft, fragile, misunderstood. Her lawyer whispered to her, but her eyes stayed fixed on me. Daniel sat apart, his posture slumped, hands clasped. He hadn't spoken to her since yesterday's revelations. The judge arrived precisely at 9. Papers rustled, chairs shifted. The room settled into that fragile silence that comes before truth is forced into daylight. "Mrs. Donovan Ellis," Judge Hawkins began, "you've requested to make a personal statement. Proceed." Grace stood, voice trembling, just enough to sound rehearsed. "Your Honor, I never intended harm to this family. My husband's mother has always seen me as an outsider. I admit I managed financial matters poorly, but only because I was overwhelmed after Mr. Ellis's passing. I loved my husband's father as if he were my own." Her voice cracked, perfectly timed. Everything I did was to preserve the company, for Daniel, for our future child. At that last word, Langford rose. "Your Honor, permission to present a final exhibit, a recorded statement obtained last night from Dr. Pamela Keene." Grace stiffened. "Objection!" her lawyer snapped. "This evidence is new and unverified." "It is verified," Langford replied evenly. "Time-stamped and notarized this morning." Judge Hawkins gestured. "Proceed." Langford connected a small recorder to the court's speaker. The doctor's calm voice filled the room. "This is Dr. Pamela Keene. I confirm that Grace Donovan Ellis visited my clinic 4 months ago for a consultation regarding fertility treatments. No pregnancy test was conducted, nor was there any indication of conception. I have reviewed all follow-up correspondence. There has been none since." Silence. Even the fan stopped creaking. Grace's lawyer muttered, "Irrelevant to estate matters." Judge Hawkins raised an eyebrow. "It speaks to credibility, counselor." "Continue." Grace's composure faltered. "That doctor misunderstood," Langford cut in. "Mrs. Donovan Ellis, the payment you sent to Dr. Keene was made from a corporate account you opened under your maiden name, correct?" She froze. "It was for consultation fees." "Using a deceased man's funds?" Her lips parted, but no words came. Langford turned to the judge. "Your Honor, we rest our case." The judge leaned back. "Mrs. Donovan Ellis, do you wish to respond?" Grace's eyes darted between Daniel and me, panic rising. Then, in a flash of defiance, she slammed both hands on the table. "You think you're better than me, Margaret. You think I don't know how Harold ran this empire? The secrets he kept?" A gasp rippled through the courtroom. She turned toward Daniel, tears streaking her makeup. "Your father wasn't a saint. He had offshore accounts. He told me himself. You all act like I'm some parasite, but I was the only one who truly cared about keeping this family alive." Her voice echoed, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Hawkins rapped his gavel. "Order! Mrs. Donovan Ellis, you will restrain yourself." But she wasn't finished. Her desperation cracked open into fury. "You don't understand. He promised me. He promised I'd be protected if anything happened." "Promised you?" Langford asked quietly. "With what? A letter?" For the first time, she hesitated. "Yes," she whispered. "He said there was a letter." The judge frowned. "A letter we have not seen?" Langford's expression sharpened. "Your Honor, there is indeed one unopened letter left in our possession, marked, 'To be read upon resolution.' We assumed it referred to the estate's conclusion." The judge gestured impatiently. "Then open it." My heart lurched. Langford reached into his briefcase, retrieved the sealed envelope, the one Harold had left behind. The paper was yellowed slightly, the wax seal unbroken. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as he sliced it open and unfolded the pages. He read aloud, "If this letter is being read, it means the truth has reached its edge. To Grace Donovan, yes, I know what you've done. You mistook kindness for weakness, flattery for access. But deception always leaves fingerprints, and yours are everywhere. To Daniel, my son. You were born with my stubbornness and your mother's heart. Use both wisely. I forgive you for being blind. Love has that effect. To Margaret, you are my compass, even when storms disguised themselves as family. If the law cannot finish this, the truth will. Harold Ellis." Grace's knees buckled. She dropped into her chair, face drained of all color. The judge cleared his throat. "I believe that settles any remaining ambiguity." Langford nodded. "We move to request full control of the estate be returned to Mrs. Ellis, with restitution from Mrs. Donovan Ellis for unauthorized withdrawals." Grace's lawyer muttered something about appeal, but his voice lacked conviction. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Motion granted. The room erupted into a low murmur. Grace sat motionless, staring at the floor. Daniel turned toward her, not with anger, but with something far worse. Disappointment. "Why," he whispered, "we had everything." She didn't answer. When it was over, I stepped outside into the sunlight. The fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp and clean. The scent of rain lingered on the stone steps, mingled with the faint sweetness of blooming magnolias. Daniel joined me after a while. His eyes were red, but his voice steady. "It's done?" "Yes," I said. "It's done." He hesitated. What will happen to her? The law will decide. But she'll have to repay what she took. As for the rest, time will handle it. He nodded, silent. As we stood there, a car door slammed behind us. Grace was being escorted to her attorney's vehicle, head bowed. For a fleeting moment, she looked back. Our eyes met, hers hollow, mine tired. No victory felt sweet that day, only necessary. Later that evening, back at the house, I walked into Harold's study one last time. The sunset poured gold through the windows, coating everything in a warm glow. The letter he'd written lay on the desk, its edges curling slightly from use. I touched it gently, then closed the drawer. The faint scent of cedar and ink surrounded me, Harold's quiet signature on the air. Rest now, I whispered. It's over. But as the light dimmed, I noticed something strange. Another envelope hidden beneath the desk mat, smaller, marked with a single word, future. I didn't open it. Not yet. Some truths, I decided, deserve to sleep a little longer. 3 weeks after the verdict, the house finally felt still again. The scent of lavender from the garden drifted through the open windows, softening the edges of memory. For the first time in months, I could breathe without hearing echoes of courtrooms or lawyers' footsteps. Grace's appeal never materialized. Within 10 days, she withdrew it entirely. Perhaps her lawyer convinced her that the evidence was ironclad, or perhaps exhaustion finally outweighed her defiance. Either way, her silence was the truest confession of all. The legal consequences came swiftly. The court ordered full restitution of the $220,000 she had withdrawn under false pretenses, plus interest and legal fees totaling $57,400. The properties she had attempted to transfer returned under the Ellis Family Trust, all 23 titles officially restored to my name and Daniel's. But victories on paper rarely fix hearts. Daniel moved out of the house he shared with Grace and rented a small apartment downtown. He visited me every few days, usually after work, always with the same quiet guilt in his eyes. Once, while standing by the old oak tree Harold had planted, he whispered, "I still don't understand how I didn't see it." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "Because you loved her. And love, my dear, blinds even the wise." He nodded, staring at the horizon. "She sent me a letter. Said she's leaving the country for a while. No apology, just farewell." "Let her go," I said gently. "Not every storm deserves a chase." We spent that evening in silence, sipping tea as twilight deepened. The clock ticked steadily, a sound that had once felt oppressive but now brought comfort. A week later, I met with Mr. Langford one final time to close the estate's paperwork. His office smelled faintly of leather and old books, the familiar perfume of endings. "All assets secured," he said, handing me the final report. "You've done your husband proud, Mrs. Ellis." I smiled faintly. "I hope so. He believed in justice, not vengeance." Langford adjusted his spectacles. "Sometimes justice and peace arrive hand in hand. Other times, they take turns." As I stood to leave, he hesitated. "There's something else." During the document audit, we discovered another sealed note from Harold labeled Future. I wasn't sure if you wanted it. My heart skipped. He left more? He handed me a small cream envelope, Harold's handwriting, faint but steady. "Yes. I believe it was meant for you, after everything was settled." That night, under the soft glow of my bedside lamp, I opened it. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means the storm is past. You've always carried the burden of protecting others, me, Daniel, even those who didn't deserve it. But I need you to do one more thing. Live. Not as a guardian, not as a judge, but as yourself. Take the garden trips you postponed. Play piano again. And when Daniel finds his way, let him choose freely, even if it scares you. My legacy was never the houses, the money, or the name. It was you, the compass that kept it all honest. Love always, Harold. Tears blurred the ink until the words shimmered like reflections on water. The scent of cedar and faint cologne rose from the paper, wrapping around me like an embrace I'd waited months to feel again. In that moment, the bitterness of the trial, the humiliation, the betrayal, all of it seemed to fade beneath the quiet weight of Harold's love. I folded the letter carefully, slid it into my jewelry box, and opened the curtains. Outside, the moon hung low over the garden, lighting the rows of rosemary and lilacs that Harold once tended. A soft breeze stirred the leaves, carrying their fragrance through the window. Down the hall, Daniel's laughter echoed faintly. He'd invited an old friend for dinner. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh since all of this began. The house, once heavy with deceit, finally exhaled. The next morning, I visited Harold's grave. The air smelled of rain and turned to earth. I placed a single sprig of rosemary on the headstone and whispered, "It's done. She can't hurt him anymore." A bird landed nearby, its song high and clear. I smiled, not at the symbolism, but at the simple peace of it. As I turned to leave, the sun broke through the clouds, casting light across the marble letters of his name. For the first time since his death, it didn't make me ache. It made me grateful. Harold had always said that truth has its own rhythm. It might come late, but it never loses its way. And now, finally, I believed him. In the quiet that followed the storm, I found myself relearning the smallest acts of peace. The smell of morning coffee no longer reminded me of interrogation rooms or late-night legal calls. Only warmth, routine, and Harold's old habit of humming while he read the newspaper. I could walk through the house now without flinching at every creak in the floorboards, without hearing echoes of whispered lies. Grief had reshaped me, yes, but it hadn't hollowed me out. It had carved room for truth. I started tending the garden again. The rosemary that once grew wild beneath the window had nearly died from neglect, but under the sunlight, new green tips began to push through the soil. I could almost hear Harold's teasing voice. "You see, Maggie, even stubborn roots can find their way back if they're watered with honesty." Daniel visited every Sunday. Sometimes he brought dinner, sometimes only silence, but both were enough. One afternoon, he confessed, "I still dream about her sometimes. She's apologizing, but when I try to listen, I wake up." "That's how regret sounds, darling," I said softly. "It talks only when we're asleep." He smiled faintly. "You really forgave her?" I thought about it, the trial, the forged documents, the endless tension. Forgiveness wasn't a door that opened all at once. It was a series of windows, cracked just enough to let light in. "Yes," I said at last, "because she already lost what mattered most. Not money, not property, but truth. You can rebuild anything except that." That night, I sat by the piano Harold had given me on our 10th anniversary. My fingers hesitated above the keys, stiff, uncertain. Then I played the song he used to hum when he cooked, a slow, lilting melody that seemed to breathe with the wind. The notes filled the room like a heartbeat returning. Outside, dusk settled over the garden. The scent of rain mingled with lilacs, and for a moment I imagined Harold standing at the gate, hat in hand, smiling, not as a ghost, but as a memory finally at rest. In the weeks that followed, letters began arriving from people who had heard about the case, widows, sons, daughters. Some thanked me for standing up against deceit. Others confessed their own battles with inheritance and betrayal. Their words carried the same thread of pain and relief. It's never about the money. It's about being believed. One letter in particular stayed with me. It was from a woman in Chicago, 63, who wrote, "Your story reminded me that silence is the soil where lies grow best. I'm speaking up before it's too late." I pinned it to my corkboard beside Harold's last letter. Every morning, it reminds me why truth, however late, is still worth the fight. The moral, I realized, wasn't about victory or revenge. It was about boundaries, about knowing when kindness turns into permission for others to trespass. Love without discernment isn't noble, it's dangerous. For those listening to my story now, I want to tell you this. Protect what's sacred, but never let fear turn your heart to stone. You can forgive without reopening the door. You can stand firm without losing grace. The world will always have its graces, people who wrap deceit in tenderness, who weaponize affection. They teach us the hardest lesson of all, that not everyone who calls you family deserves the title. But there will also be Daniels, the ones who learn, who grow, who eventually see the difference between charm and character. And there will always be people like Harold, quiet guardians who leave behind truths strong enough to outlive their voices. To anyone out there standing in the middle of your own storm, betrayed, doubted, gaslit, remember, the truth doesn't shout. It waits. It lets the noise exhaust itself. Then when the time is right, it steps forward and speaks in the only language that endures, proof. So tell your story. Even if your voice shakes, even if no one believes you at first, because somewhere, someone will hear it and find the courage to tell theirs too. If you've ever faced something like this, a battle over trust, inheritance, or the price of loyalty, share it below. Maybe your story will be the next one I tell. And if this story found you tonight, don't leave without taking its message with you. Silence protects liars. Truth protects legacies. Love wisely. Forgive slowly. Trust only when earned. Thank you for listening. From my home to yours. From one survivor of family storms to another. Until next time, stay safe, stay kind, and never let anyone rewrite your story for you.